All right, everybody, let's begin. My name is Dan Vogel. With me is Bob Johnson. We're part of the integration management team up here at the Office of the Chief Information Officer. We thank you very much for attending this webcast today. Today's topic will be IT configuration management, specifically focusing on the summary outbrief of the process development workshop. This was a fifth in a series of 5 workshops that were held, where we pulled in teams from across the agency to review IT configuration management. What we will be doing is we are recording this, so we will be posting the recordings. If you have people that weren't able to attend today that you'd like to hear what's going on, we'll make those recordings available. This is the first also in a series of WebExes on IT configuration management. I believe we have 4 others planned.
Just want to point out, too, that as some of you probably already know, a lot of these WebExes will be repeats. So certainly don't sign up for them unless you want to, but it's to cover the greater audiences out there.
Okay. So let's move on. Let's start on slide 1. Of course, the mission, which was similar to the other process development workshops that we held, was to identify and agree upon an IT configuration management process that's appropriate for the agency and the centers. So this is not something that's specific to OCIO. It's not something that's specific to one particular technology group. This was to identify all NASA stuff and how it fits together from an IT perspective. The focus initially is I3P, of course, but I think as it moves forward, it certainly opens itself up to all other areas of technology. And of course, when looking at configuration management and processes in particular, we look at not only the process, but we also look at some of the roles and the activity plans associated with it. Configuration management means a lot of things to a lot of different people, so we took the perspective of IT asset and configuration management from the ITIL v3 construct. We looked at not only the config items and assets, but also the control of them. We looked at recording and reporting, how that goes through change management. We looked at verification and audit of those config items and assets. So on an ongoing basis, I think we've started with an initial very strong first cut at what IT configuration management is from an I3P perspective.
What's it say, CM?
Software Asset and Configuration Management.
Thank you.
Okay. On slide 2, a couple of the objectives mentioned already that it's an agency-wide configuration management process. We looked at the tasks and the critical success factors. I think configuration management was a little more difficult than some of the very natural processes like incident and change management, which have a beginning and an end. Configuration management is really kind of an ongoing control mechanism. We looked at the as-is, the way people identified it or interpreted configuration management across the centers. Tried to identify a 2B. Now it says process. We also looked at just a core model associated with configuration management, and we'll get into that in a little while. We looked at some of the top issues. We looked at some of the typical waste areas, some of the critical roles and responsibilities for configuration management, even the performance measures, risks and mitigations, and the development of a post-workshop activity plan. Now, these are all things that we've done in all the other workshops, and they held true for this one as well.
Okay. Again, as most of you are familiar with the process development workshops that we've been running for, I guess, almost a year now, the approach has been a mix of Lean Six Sigma and certainly ITIL as the basis for service management. Again, ITIL is being adopted throughout NASA as the best framework and to move forward with IT service management, and certainly that is what we expect from our service providers as declared on the RFP. So again, using Six Sigma, define, measure, analyze, improve, and control, and pretty much a good tool to use to get to a optimum process at a certain level. The principles that we used as team members going forward was certainly the ITIL v3 framework alignment. Everything we do has to align with ITIL. Now, again, ITIL doesn't tell you how to do it, but it does tell you what to do in certain areas. And as Dan said, we're going to talk a lot about the configuration management lifecycle model. Customer focus, that's actually number one with everything we did. Appropriate roles and responsibilities, who can do it today? And I know we and the centers are going through a lot of changes right now with this, so this was real important in our minds. And differentiate configuration management from pure asset management. These are the rules that we set forth. What is configuration management? It's the process responsible for ensuring and selecting components of the configuration items. Again, configuration items can be anything. And these have to be identified. They have to be baselined in some kind of database. This database has to be maintained, and any changes that take place within the database to a configuration or configuration item certainly has to be controlled. The configuration management assures the definitions of the CIs, the discovery and mapping, management of the relationships, which is really important to our initial ESD turn-up, the relationships of the different CIs, especially when you call in with a incident management problem issue. And as I said, integration with other processes, problem, change, and service request management.
So on slide 6, a lot of people think, well, how do I use configuration management? So I think some people get it confused with inventory management. They get confused with asset management. Think of configuration management as all my IT stuff and how that stuff fits together. So you could have a desktop with different components associated with it. You've got attributes, make, model, born on date, expected expiration date associated with it. And we want to maintain integrity of the environment. So by knowing all my stuff and how that stuff fits together, we can use it for things like change management, for risk management. We can use it for incident management. If something broke or something got changed and other things broke, what was that chain of activity? We had to really make a distinction between asset and configuration management while doing the workshop. So between these two circles on slide 6, you see some of that delineation. So configuration management, what are the CI definitions? What's the relevance of particular config items? The attributes, the relationships across them, looking at discovery and mapping of critical config items and just general configuration management system management. Asset management, on the other hand, is a little bit more financially oriented. It's a little bit more life cycle oriented, associated with, procurement. How do I get something? How do I retire it? Or how do I look at disposal, or things that are even non-IT assets? But somewhere in the middle, there's a joining of the two, and there's this very strong relationship. And part of that is going to include things like aging of the items, integration with processes, shared discovery tools. The stuff in the middle is really, will come together by doing configuration and asset management independently. You'll have that stuff in the middle. But we didn't want to confuse people by having that, well, what is asset versus config? So for right now, think of everything on that left-hand side. Likewise, on slide 7, you hear us talk a lot about, or you hear in the industry a lot of people speak about a configuration management system as well as configuration management databases. So the basics here are that think of configuration management. Everybody's got their own little database, and whether that's on a spreadsheet or in an Access database or in something a lot more complex, it could be Remedy Atrium or whatever HP has. Everybody's still going to maintain their configuration management databases. So they'll have their stores of configuration records about their config items and their relationships. But on a larger scale, there has to be some kind of articulation or view into the whole, the larger view of NASA. So from a configuration management system perspective, what we look at is a view of service configurations across the environment. So again, it's more from a service view. It will touch all or pull from all those independent configuration management databases, but ultimately the configuration management system is nothing more than a big viewing vehicle for and across multiple independent configuration management databases. Now, that's a lot of stuff. So on slide 8, what you see is a little bit of how we view configuration management. So you could spend your lifetime identifying items, identifying the attributes, trying to look at all the relationships across them and come up with the perfect configuration management. That's really not what we're going for. There is limited time, there's limited resource, there's limited tolerance from the technologists that have to enter this information in or manage and keep this, validate, verify this information exists. So one of the things we started to do in the workshop was to identify for each service area, each I3P service area specifically, what are those config items that are critical to the delivery of their services, and what are the attributes, the core identifiers associated with those config items that are necessary to capture. We're looking at a slice of the whole cake. We're looking at just enough to have that transition between our customers and users to us as NASA IT to our supplier and back. So what are those, core least common denominators between all the different teams? On slide 9, Bob, you want to take that?
Yeah, so Dan alluded to a life cycle model, and that's what this is showing. This is essentially 5 different activity areas that are key to configuration management, and the team agreed that certainly this would be our approach. So we're going to march through each one of these. The first one is plan. After that is identify, control, record and report, and then verify and audit. With those particular areas, we wanted to take a look at what we had today from an as-is standpoint. So again, looking at that life cycle model, what do we have today? The team put up at a certain level what exists today. And again, obviously with NASA and the different centers and MDs, there's a multitude of configuration models and processes and systems that are out there. So we tried to identify these based on those different activities and put those on the board, agreed to those, and then we voted on, from a value standpoint, which one were the most valuable to NASA today as it stands. And certainly from a waste issue standpoint, we voted on which one of these activities or tasks had no value and should be improved upon. These are what we identified from an issues waste standpoint. We try to do the 80-20 rule so we can attack some of these waste areas. You can see that the team voted on a top 5. The first one was lack of consistent configuration management policy throughout the agency, no configuration management governance throughout the agency, no centralized discovery view, conflicting data on the same CIs. In other words, there could be the same IT asset items that are described in different ways by different service areas. And there's no centralized configuration management reporting. So with these 5, we used some lean Six Sigma tools and attacked them, if you will, all for the improvement of those waste areas using the Ishikawa diagram or chart, which looks at in great detail and depth the causes and whys of that issue or waste area. And then we went to a mitigation tool called the source of variation matrix and tried to mitigate those causes and whys for each issue.
And one of the other things we did was, after looking at the issues and the risks, everybody put their heads together and they said, okay, well, given the current state of configuration management and knowledge about our IT stuff and how it fits together and how we're intending to use this going forward, people put ideas on little white scraps of paper, which you see on the right-hand side of slide 13. And we tried to sort these by way of which ones had the biggest benefit and which ones could be easily implemented and which ones were a little harder to implement. So we came up with the structure. It's a pretty common Six Sigma tool. It's called a pick chart. And we identified, based on, again, benefit and implementation, which ones are possible, which ones we should just implement because they have a big benefit and they're easy to do, which ones are going to be a challenge, and which ones, because they're hard and really have a small payoff, we're just going to kill those ideas right away. Put those on the board, and that's what you see on the right-hand side there. Now, configuration management is a difficult concept. It's difficult for people to think about, well, how low do we go with regard to config? You know, do I look at a heat sink on a, you know, on a portable laptop, or on a, probably a bad example, in a rack? Or do I go down to the power supply? Or do I need to get down to the IP level? Should we not even have an IP address listed because of security? These are all things that have to be identified. So when we looked at ideas on what we should do, a lot of them centered around, well, who's going to manage it? How do we actually get this in place and build it? As well as, you know, what's the right structure? So you see a lot of challenge types of ideas there as opposed to things that are relatively easy to implement. Now on slide 14, we'll get into some of the critical success factors, one of which is developing an agency IT configuration management plan. We want to ensure data accuracy, integrity, and availability. We want to make sure that once it's in place, that people keep it up to date, and that we understand that, you know, if people don't keep up with it and don't document what has been changed, then the whole thing is for naught. So we have to make a pretty concerted effort to ensure that we have the right structure and that we transition it appropriately. When it's implemented, we're going to try and do it in a phased approach. You know, remember the slices of the cake idea. We want to make sure that when we establish it, that an initial accurate baseline is established, so that when the ESD or change management or anybody else makes an alteration to the configs, that they get captured. And then we want to document it in a standardized configuration item schema that's appropriate for NASA prior to the service phase in start dates. And that's one of the things we're already working on with the different service areas. Additional critical success factors on slide 15, technical integration. So we're saying it's a federated database, you know, a federated source of information. We know that people are going to have their independent databases and spreadsheets and such, but we do need that overarching view from an agency perspective. Establish and justify an agreed level of data for collecting and maintaining config item data. Again, we're going across the different service areas to ensure that that's done appropriately. We're going to adopt a top-down config item development approach, really focused on identifying services and service elements for each of the CIs, and then ultimately try and justify the level of accuracy based on what's appropriate for NASA from a business perspective. We can certainly do it manual. We can certainly do this in an automated fashion, but there has to be some kind of, I won't say a give and take, but a concerted effort to determine how far we need to go with it. Slide 16, we get into the 2B state. This is a pretty traditional type of activity that we conducted in each of the workshops. And again, up across the top, you see things like management and planning and identification activities and control activities. And we started identifying, okay, this is what we think it needs to be, or what needs to happen in association with the process. On slides 17 and 18, this is really where you get to see the output of that model that was just up. Very high level here. Essentially what happens is, within the first 5 boxes, very control-oriented, very planning-oriented. What is it we're going to look at from a config view? What are the items and attributes? You know, which items are under what type of management, and then who are the owners for those individual components? Okay, so it's very structural in nature. When you get to the second half of the page and you see the little change management box in green, any determination that's been made regarding configuration management has to ultimately go through change management to get into the environment. So whether we start off with nothing and we say, okay, these are the ones going forward, that's got to be in change management. Likewise, if we're in the process and a new configuration item is required, it has to go through that whole front section to make sure that that's the right item at the right level with the right attributes, with the right owner, before it gets into the ultimate environment via the change management process. So you'll see things like there an addition required, checking the configuration management structures for the right configuration item data. If a new one is required, again, it's going to go through that whole process. If we realize that it's there, then we're going to look at, on slide 18, assignment of the config item to subject matter experts. So ultimately, who's responsible for handling those types of configuration items on a regular basis, updates of those items, if there's any additional subject matter expertise involved, it gets routed back. If there's an adjustment to a contract that's required, it gets handled through contract management and then ultimately change management. And then, so from right where we are now, we've gone through the control phase, the development of the structure phase. We've put it into the environment with the last portion that I just mentioned. But on the other side now, we need to ensure that on an ongoing basis, that what we thought we put into the environment, or what we think is there, and what we think is pretty solid information-wise, is still there and is still accurate and has in fact been managed through change management. So ultimately, on the back end, there has to be some configuration audit of the environment. We need to make sure that if there's any information that's lacking, or inventories aren't correct, or some of the relationships have been broken and it wasn't documented, that we identify that on an ongoing basis. A lot of that information is going to be manual. Now, there are a lot of tools out there, auto-discovery and dependency mapping tools, which do have the potential to identify, or with our guidance, our being NASA's guidance, that some configuration items should not be changed. And they can, in fact, lock down configuration items. They can, in fact, identify alterations to a config item area versus the baseline. So there is some automation help that wasn't available back in the 2002 timeframe, but again, there's still manual hands-on stuff that has to occur on an ongoing basis.
All right, so some of the risk that apply to this model, this 5-step model, again, plan, identification, control, report, and then validate and audit. Some of the risk that apply to that, we identified the top 3. And the first one is if the configuration management team is not operational by October 10th. What does that mean? It's real key. Our CMDB is going to be the CMDB in the system that Remedy is going to be used, the Remedy system that's going to be used by the Enterprise Service Desk down at Stennis. Now, because of that, if we get the baseline right and we put that in, all these other steps, the control, the reporting, and validation have to take place after that. So we have the date of October 2010. We think that may change. Dates are changing constantly when it comes to the different sequencing and waves for the contracts. But you can see the importance and why it's that the CMDB that's going to be part of ESD has to be properly input with the proper CIs. If the new CMDB is not available or has integrity issues, pretty much the same issue as the first one, but a little bit different in the sense that the CIs aren't properly identified and aligned. And then the last one is if NASA does not have valid CI identification. This would be if a service area, as it's to be waved in to the ESD, if you will, in phases, its CIs or depth of CIs that were agreed to have not been identified. But we know that transition teams are working on that right now. So these are the risks, and these are the likelihoods, and the mitigations I won't go through. The performance measurement, again, as you know, it's key. If you have a new process, a new model, it has to be measurable. You have to know that you're successful. So what we came up with as a team was, again, the baseline, very important high-level KPIs that apply to CI. Number one is you can see SLAs due to a CI error. So in other words, SLAs could be off because the CI wasn't identified properly, therefore the SLA can't be measured. We're looking for the percentage of incorrect CIs. Hopefully that'll go down over time as this CMD matures and the service owners and the analysts who administer the CMDB and are responsible for the CIs and configuration management mature. Some of the other ones would be the unauthorized CI changes. So just think of the change management process. Key to that is configuration items. Key to that is a valid CMDB. So pretty much hand in hand with change management. So I'm not going to go through them all, but there's scores and scores more that are really important to this process, and it has to do with progressing over time with validity and accuracy of the CIs in the database.
Okay. Now, we've discussed the process, we've discussed the model, we've discussed the some of the performance measures and the risks. Just as importantly, there are a couple roles that are involved with making configuration management happen. And by role, we don't mean an individual. We don't mean this is a person or a team or a group. Think of it as another hat. Okay, so you have to look at it as from an agency perspective. Configuration management is going to have a lot of stuff. So there has to be some kind of effort put to ensure that on an ongoing basis, the agency adheres to all applicable configuration management process information and methods. So in doing so, they're going to look at some of the overall objectives, protecting the integrity of the environment, ensuring that change is where any kind of introduction to configuration alterations occur, evaluation of the efficiency and effectiveness of the existing configuration management systems, once they're in place, agreeing to the scope of any kind of other process integration points, and really ensuring that all the staff are aware of what's required for configuration management processes. So this configuration manager role, it could be agency-wide, which would be great, and it could be center-wide, which would be okay, but we really need something at the larger level and not this is my technology focus, desktop configuration manager. It's probably a bad idea. All right, let's move on to slide 24. Similarly, we need some kind of configuration analysts or administrator role to ensure that any kind of plan and its implementation really does get carried out on a regular basis. So whereas a manager would ensure overall accountability for it, the analysts or administrators would have responsibility. Providing any kind of required training, more of the hands-on type of activities are what you're going to find with an analyst or an administrator. Creating the processes and procedures, making sure that they're continually updated, evaluating proprietary tools and making recommendations so that the ones that are selected are appropriate overall, monitoring the performance and the capacity of the existing systems, maybe making recommendations for improvement. Ultimately, though, these are the folks that are going to ensure the integrity of really at the operational level of the configuration management systems. The config manager, overall, overarching, everything looks good. Major alterations or, major flags being raised, they're going to handle that. But on the operational level, it's really going to be these configuration analysts and administrators that are going to make things happen. On slide 25, you see a traditional RACI model. This was the initial cut that came out of the Kaizen or the Process Development Workshop event. Down on the left-hand side, you see a lot of the roles, config manager, the analyst again that we spoke about. PIM is process integration manager. That was very new at the time of the workshop. Service integration manager, center integration lead, service office lead. A lot of these roles have been discussed. A lot of them have been defined and agreed to as of July. Communication of them and how they apply to service offices at your centers, that still needs to be done. Okay. On the top right, you'll see things like some of the major process tasks associated with the model. So when it comes to planning and development of how we're going to get this done, the accountable party is that configuration manager. The key responsible parties are going to be the manager, but also the analysts, the service execs, because they're going to be the ones owning the contract, and then the service managers. Identification of the right config items. A lot of that's going to rest with the config analysts in conjunction with the service execs. Personally, I probably would have put it with the service execs because they're, you have to say, for my service area, these are the items and attributes that are most relevant. Control, that's really going to be a day-to-day analyst responsibility. Accountability resting with the config manager. Now, recording and reporting of the changes and the status, that's going to be an everything to everybody job. And I think ultimately, there are a lot of eyes, there are a lot of informed, but given the status of what we knew those roles to be at the time, they came up to be a lot of eyes, basically just informed with regard to that task. I think given what we know today, you're going to see that the center integration lead, the service office integration leads, the subject matter experts, the service element managers, I think that's what they're called. They're going to participate quite heavily in that recording and reporting of those items status changes. And then ultimately verification and audit, again, very heavily relying on the analysts and administrators to do that.
Okay, so it was pretty important that coming out of this, obviously, the CMDB and the greater CMS system and configuration management system were on our mind. We wanted to come out of here with guidance on what is a CI. Certainly not the policy, because as Dan said, that's the configuration management's role, to write the policy, do the planning. But from a baseline template standpoint, we thought we owed it to the service owners and the configuration management teams a basic template for CI. Nothing real deep here, but certainly from a top-down approach, you want to kind of keep it simple. You want to go down so many layers that keeps it effective for what you're trying to do from an IT service management standpoint. What does that mean? Dan alluded to how deep do you want to go. For example, with the PC, do you really want to have your mouse as a CI? Probably not. But if you look at this, in this particular area is West, and we put this up because it's one of the first contracts that's going to come in, some basic attributes to the configuration item we thought was real important. Certainly service owner, the location, phone number, email, things we're all familiar with today when you call the help desk. So they either know this or they're going to ask you some of these things. A documentation standpoint within the database, who is the owner, what is the document name, sometimes what is the policy, what are some other procedures that may be important to that particular service. And then in this case, because it's West, if it is a website, what is the URL, who owns that particular web service, who are the users, and what are the different DMARCs for that particular service. So we didn't want to go too deep, but we did want to come out of this with a basic template to give everybody a pretty good feel for what CI should be, getting back to trying to keep it as simple, but keep it very effective. So that's what this is. And when we talk about the activity, well, we'll talk about it now. The activities, we actually finished this particular activity, and we have handed these over to the different service owners to populate, and then work with the transition teams to get that into the CMDB with Paul Rydeen and ESD.
I think the ESD comment is important too, because we were looking at it from what is the least information that would be required for one of our customers, customer user of NASA IT, to go to the service desk, help them articulate who they are or what the issue is, and have that information carried over to the Tier 2, 3 service providers. Likewise, the Tier 2, 3 service providers, if they had a planned service outage, they might say, watch out for these config items, service desk, go communicate to these folks. So there had to be a minimum amount of information required to be able to do that, and some of that is why you see it at this level.
Okay, I talked about the activities, that being a real important one, and that is actually the third activity you see listed here. It should be green, but because our team is finished with it, but it's not green because it's under review right now by the different service owners, the different service executives, if you will, for networking and user services, data, web, and communications.
And user support.
And user support. So it's all the different 5 categories of which I just went blank. But the first one is configuration management roles and responsibilities. That has been finished. Sue Lemon out of Langley was the lead there, and we've finished the draft, and that is due September 30th. That will be moved on real quick as we just basically finished the final review of the draft this week. Documentation of detailed process flow, that's been done. So the life cycle model that Dan showed you, that's been done and has been posted on the SharePoint. So again, a great team. Some core members for all 5 processes that we refined. We worked very, very hard. As Dan said, this one was pretty difficult, trying to get to the right level, trying to make sure that we get the message out of what we're trying to do here. And it is, as I said at the end, it's to assist the transition teams in the different service areas to populate the CMDB at a level that's going to be effective. And then from after that, certainly to keep discovery going, to maintain the database, to have control of the different CIs, typically through change management and other processes, and then to report those and validate those ongoing from a lifecycle standpoint. So that was the team. Some of you are on the call, I can see right now, so thank you.
I think too, because of our situation and, getting people together for 5 days is quite an achievement. We understand that there were people that, we would have loved to have had involved in this activity. And we still want participation from those people. So if you know folks or you are one of those folks that would like to have input into the config items and attributes that you think are most critical to your service areas, definitely let those service owners know, whether it's end user, communication, data center, East or, applications or web, let them know, hey, I've got input that I think is valuable for that configuration management effort, and we'll help them get that information in.
So at this point, we're open for questions, if you have any. If you do have questions after this, again, we're going to have 1 or 2 more of these, and you'll see those invites going out in the next couple of weeks. Some went out today. And also, please spread the word that whoever has not come to the other process outbriefs, they're being scheduled too, and some of those invites went out today. So really appreciate the participation today. We can see there's a lot of folks on the line. So thank you so much. If you do have questions, contact Dan or I, either call us or email us, and we'll be glad to follow up. Thanks so much.